listeners, host Grace Anna here. Today we are collaborating with our friends at Art of History, a podcast that explores different historical events and figures through an examination of works of art. Host and art historian Amanda Mata releases new episodes every month on wide-ranging topics. Her episodes discuss subjects from women artists and the spirit world to forgotten princesses of history, and even to the ghosts of Hampton Court Palace, to name a few. Art of History is available to listen on all streaming platforms. Today we are sharing Art of History's episode on Lucrezia Borgia, the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI, who briefly ruled the Vatican in the Pope's absence in 1501. Lucrezia, who eventually became the Duchess of Ferrara, lived a fascinating and drama-filled life, and despite the many restrictions on women of her time, was groundbreaking in her ascension to power. She not only briefly ruled the Vatican, but played an active role in the political landscape of Ferrara. We hope to have a full episode of ArtMuse dedicated to Lucrezia Borgia in a future season. There have been a number of portraits of Lucrezia Borgia made throughout history. Most famously, she is depicted in pre-Raphaelite painter Frank Cadogan Cowper's Lucrezia Borgia Reigns in the Vatican in the Absence of Pope Alexander VI, painted in 1910 and currently at the Tate in London. In the words of host Amanda Mata, how did she gain this rare position of power? And how does Frank Cadogan Cowper's striking pre-Raphaelite painting mirror our cultural perception of her? Unravel the myths surrounding Lucrezia Borgia. Explore the evolution of women's roles in the Catholic Church, and examine how history, scandal, and art collide in depicting one of the Renaissance most enigmatic women. So without further ado, we hope you enjoy Art of History's episode on Lucrezia Borgia.
Hello, and welcome to the Art of History podcast. My name is Amanda Mata. I have a degree in art history and a lot of thoughts on the movie Conclave. Ralph Fiennes, King of My Heart. And that is going to play directly into our theme for today's episode. So if you haven't seen the movie Conclave, first of all, I give you full permission to stop what you're doing and go watch it. It's not going to become spoilery at any point, except for like maybe a little bit at the end of the episode. So you'll definitely still get a lot out of my ramblings here, even if you haven't seen the film, but I do highly recommend it. Basically, to give you my Cliff's Notes of this movie, the Vatican has always been messy as hell. The papacy, cardinalship, I don't know what the word is, messy as hell. Okay, a lot of the buzz about this movie has involved comparisons to the film Mean Girls, which absolutely 100% founded. And I am saying this today as a Catholic, all right? So a little bit about me if you haven't picked up on it from other episodes, or if this is your first time listening. Hi, hello. I would describe myself as a cultural Catholic. I'm also, a woman, a historian, and I have a lot of context on these men who run the show. And so that has contributed to like my own spirituality quite a lot in my adulthood. I was trying to be a practicing Catholic up until I went to grad school. And then I had this moment, this is relevant, I swear. I had this moment, I think it was like New Year's, and I was in the Basilica in Philadelphia because I lived right by there. So that was like the place I got to go for mass. It was beautiful. I think the Archbishop was there on this occasion. And I remember there was just this parade of men who were, I guess, entering seminary or like in seminary training to be priests. And it was one after the other after the other. And we were supposed to pray over them and, great. But like, I was just sitting there. I was like, what about the women? Like, what about the women? Oh my gosh. And based on what I know about the church, which I'm going to go through today a little bit, that's not always been the case. That was an active choice in church leadership to exclude women, and it continues to be an active choice today. And for that reason, I really just like fell out of love with the church as an institution. This coincided, of course, with the ongoing scandals in the Catholic Church. I think like 4 out of 5 priests that I personally like grew up with going to mass under have had some kind of sexual scandal. Like, that's insane numbers wise. But like myself personally, I still believe in a lot of the spirituality aspects of Catholicism. I really love how personal it can feel. So, I just remembered too, trigger warning, I was also lightly groomed by my youth pastor in high school. So there's a lot that goes into this for me. I don't have all the answers, but what I do have for you today is context, and I wanted to give that little spiel up top just so you know where I'm coming from, and what my perspective is. If you are a diehard tithe every Sunday Catholic, you might not like some of this, but it is history, because that's what this show is about. If it is your first time listening, I'm so sorry. But this is a show where we take works of art and we use them as a window to the past. And today we're also using the movie Conclave. The static work of art that I have chosen to guide this conversation today is Lucrezia Borgia Reigns in the Vatican in the Absence of Pope Alexander VI from 1910. This is by the pre-Raphaelite painter Frank Cadogan, I think is how you say it, Cowper, and it is in the Tate Britain, London. I will have the artwork as well as supplemental images over on the show's Instagram for you. That is at Art of History Podcast. While you're over there, just give us a follow. It saves you time for future episodes. You'll get updates when a new episode has dropped. And if you're feeling so inclined, please give this episode a nice rating, or I guess the show a nice rating on Apple Podcasts, or a review is even better. They really both help a lot getting us in front of new listeners. But without further ado, sit back, relax. This is going to be a very meandering tale. It will weave in and out of the modern age at a few points, but mainly we are in the Renaissance today. Because this painting, although completed in 1910, it is, as the Tate describes, a recreation of an obscure and scandalous incident from the history of the popes. In 1501, the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI, Lucrezia Borgia, took his place at a meeting. Now, if you haven't seen the show, The Borgias, you might be thinking, hang on, daughter of a pope, what did I miss? So let's start there. We're going to take it way back to early Christianity just for a second. In the 1st through 4th centuries, the clergy in the early church were not required at all to be celibate. Priests, bishops, even the early popes, some of them were married. The expectation, though, was that they would remain faithful within their marriage rather than, abstaining from relations with the opposite sex entirely. The shift towards absolute celibacy, which we kind of expect from priests today, although, this took place between the 4th and 12th centuries, very gradually. It differed by region. In 306, the Council of Elvira, which took place in Spain, was the first to suggest total celibacy for the clergy, but this decision was not enforced. It was kind of just like a suggestion. In 325, the Council of Nicaea reaffirmed that married men could become priests, but this council encouraged abstinence or even separate dwellings within marriage. So, if you had a wife, fine, you could keep her, but you couldn't touch her and you maybe couldn't live with her. Different bishops, I have to assume married versus celibate ones, were pushing for different things after this council. This did go all the way up to mandatory celibacy for all clergy in some areas. By the 11th century, so skipping ahead quite a bit, Pope Gregory VII was aggressively pushing for priestly celibacy as part of his reforms. He said that anyone being ordained must first pledge celibacy. I believe his actual words were that priests had to first escape from the clutches of their wives before they could become priests. Finally, in 1139, something called the Second Lateran Council made clerical marriages officially invalid across the board. This really solidified the celibacy rule and made that the norm. It did so by decreeing that bishops, priests, deacons, and others in holy orders who married would be separated from their partners. They would also do penance for their behavior, and anyone who knew a cleric was married or, quote, had a concubine could not hear their masses. So you couldn't go to church and listen to a priest who you knew had like a wife back at home. Otherwise, you yourself would have to do penance. As to why this shift was happening, great question. We'll set the women part aside for now because attitudes towards women, they're popping off even in the 300s. But I would say the cultural shifts in the Catholic Church, which ultimately become solidified, more come from church politics, not theology. And that's kind of what we see in the early days of the church. Land and wealth are major, major concerns up through the Renaissance. The idea with priests having families and marriages and children was that if they had legitimate heirs, the lands belonging to the church could become part of those children's inheritance. There would be these hereditary dynasties within the church if this was allowed to keep happening. The church's holdings would become weakened. Celibacy was a tool to ensuring that wealth stayed within the church rather than being divided among family members. This was also a problem when nepotism starts to come into play. High-ranking church officials openly provided for their children time and time again where they existed. These anxieties coincide with what is going on in the political sphere during the early Middle Ages. Royal families are consolidating power through conquests, but also through dynasties and alliances through marriages. The church is seeking to avoid that type of political infighting over leadership. During the Renaissance, the papacy is still kind of functioning like a royal court, and popes are still securing power for their families. So this is what we're trying to root out with the celibacy decrees. We're going to be in the Renaissance for the bulk of the episode today. You should know that during this time, priests, bishops, and popes are ignoring the celibacy requirement. In fact, popes probably have the most authority to ignore that requirement because they're the top of the food chain. They're the ones calling the shots, dictating church doctrine. Examples from around this time include Pope Innocent VIII, who had multiple children and acknowledged them. Pope Julius II, the one who commissioned the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he had at least one daughter. And Pope Alexander VI, who we are going to focus on today. That is Lucrezia Borgia's father. I will also say at this point, if you ask me a question about the different popes, what they did, what they're known for, I will not have an answer for you. There are entire books and podcasts related to that topic. I personally enjoy the ones that are more of a cultural lens than like a religious one. I think you get more meat out of the biography that way, but just know that I'm not going to go that route today. There are other church traditions, like eating fish on Fridays and during Lent, that are thought of as like religious in nature, but actually have more cultural roots than theological ones. With the fish thing, it's more economic than anything. During the medieval period, from my understanding, the fishing industry was struggling and the church encouraged fish consumption to support it. A lot of monasteries also controlled fisheries and sold fish to the public. So this was a way of providing an economic stimulus to the fish industry because there is no scriptural mandate for, I think, abstaining from meat at all on Fridays, like fasting as a thing, but the definition of what that is really cultural. So yeah, there's another example of a church-imposed rule that is serving economic and political interests rather than our spiritual ones. You can also think about marriage restrictions and annulments in the church, especially during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. These were more about political alliances and power, not morality. You could get a marriage annulled. It actually happened all the time, but who got them and who didn't was based on political convenience. The famous example, Henry VIII, he made this request from the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This was denied, not because his arguments weren't good. He claimed the marriage was invalid because she had first been married to his brother, so it was like a type of incest. But the Pope was hearing arguments also from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. So there were political reasons that Charles obviously wanted his aunt in the court of England, and that superseded the Pope's spiritual considerations of Henry VIII's marriage. In contrast, popes are weaponizing annulments, especially when it comes to powerful families, in some cases their own. So Lucrezia Borgia, who we are going to zoom in on today, had several marriages which were annulled or otherwise ended, we will get there, on dubious grounds. Her dad's the Pope, so there are things happening, is all I will say. I don't want to give you any spoilers. I have paced this episode in a certain way for a reason. So let's meet the Borgia family first, and the man kind of at the center of them, who, yes, does become Pope. This is Rodrigo de Borgia, who was born near Valencia, Spain. Borgia at this time is spelled Borja. He moves to Italy at age 14. His name becomes Italianized, to Borgia with a G-I instead of a J. In Italy, or I guess the Italian states, it's not unified yet, but for all intents and purposes, Italy, he begins rising up the ranks of the church. He eventually becomes a cardinal through a lot of nepotism. The papacy changed hands rapidly during the Renaissance, and Rodrigo de Borgia's first stroke of good luck came when his uncle was named Pope Calixtus III. So in this time, Rodrigo was made a deacon and then a cardinal deacon of San Nicola in Carcere at the age of 25 in 1456. I should have said this. I did not take Italian. I took French. I did not take Latin. I'm going to be struggling. I tried my best. In 1457, Rodrigo was appointed vice-chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, and in 1468, he was ordained to the priesthood. By 1471, he was made a bishop and appointed the cardinal bishop of Albano. In all, Borgia served under 5 popes, meaning during his time in the church, he acquired a lot of administrative experience, influence, goodwill, and most importantly, wealth. In August 1492, following the death of Pope Innocent VIII, Rodrigo de Borgia is elected by the College of Cardinals and takes on the papal name Alexander VI. So he's the top dog. If you have seen Conclave or have seen it advertised for Oscar consideration, which I think it fully deserves, this is what's going on. The conclave is assembled to elect the next pope. I think it's like a 2/3 majority. You go through several rounds of voting until you get that. And it's more political than anything. Honestly, it's about who's going to lead the church in the direction we want it to be led in. It should be about who has the best spiritual guidance, but that's not always the case. Also in that movie, if you've watched, you see a moment where the pope who gets elected is asked what his papal name will be. You do get to choose your name. There are a few of them that get chosen from, and I think this is to connect you to the lineage of church leadership that has come before you, kind of once again, a political dynasty with kings all kind of being named Louis or Henry. We have 16 Pope Benedicts, it's kind of the same thing. So as Rodrigo was being considered for the papacy, as he was kind of quietly campaigning among the College of Cardinals to be voted pope, because you do have to state your case on the DL, there were rumors that he had bought his way in. This is called simony. Spoiler alert, also a plot point in Conclave, basically where you are bribing people for votes to elect you pope. These rumors, when they surround I don't know if I should call him Borgia or Alexander at this time. I wish I could poll the audience. I'm going to say Borgia. He's Pope. It's the same person. These rumors, as they swirl around Borgia, are thought to be just kind of slander. The other 2 cardinals who were in contention as he's being voted in also probably bribed for votes and were not successful. So maybe the question is just who did it best. But Borgia, as Pope Alexander, becomes known for his quote-unquote debauchery. He is openly ignoring the celibacy requirement, as a lot of popes did, because who is going to punish them? Nobody. He has several children by several mistresses. And about half of them he openly acknowledges as his own children. So again, he's creating a dynasty within the Vatican. Not a place you normally expect to find it, but this is kind of the last gasp of popes having dynasties of their own. I do not have time simply to get into all of his controversial antics. Just know that he was seen as, even by his contemporaries, very, very scandalous. That's why we do have things like the TV show The Borgias, which I wanted to watch. It is so beautiful. The actors are so beautiful, but it just plays into every single like unsubstantiated, really damaging rumor about this whole family. And like, I wasn't here for it. So we will get into it, particularly with Lucrezia. That made me mad. But yeah, his name, the Borgias, becomes a stand-in in his own time and even today as like just this suggestion of really debased standards of the papacy. One thing I do have to tell you about, because it's just so infamous, is something called the Banquet of the Chestnuts, where Pope Alexander, the Borgia, he hosted a bunch of people for dinner, and each one, apparently his guest was a prostitute. At the end of the meal, they cleared away all the tables, they had the women get naked, and they threw roasted chestnuts on the floor. The women were supposed to run around on all fours, collecting chestnuts with their mouths and putting them in buckets, squealing like pigs. Whoever collected the most chestnuts apparently was the winner. Yeah. And this is something that Rodrigo de Borgia is hosting as Pope, right? Like his family is there. Lucrezia is there. She is a young woman at this time. And can you imagine what she's thinking? I cannot. Why was the Vatican standing for this? Like, why were the cardinals allowing it? You gotta really understand, in the Renaissance, even back to the Middle Ages, the Pope was like a king. That's why there's so much anxiety about Catholics during the Protestant Reformation, because they're concerned that Catholics are going to swear allegiance to the Pope before the actual king. So Pope Alexander VI, he is innately political. He's also lavishing in his role. He is as much focused too on diplomacy and foreign policy as he is with spiritual guidance. He also continues the tradition of nepotism. He appoints his son Cesare, the Archbishop of Valencia. Incidentally, this is a post that was created for Alexander VI by his uncle Calixtus. Also, incidentally, Cesare was 17 and a student at the time that he was created an archbishop. So that's fun. But the nepotism and all of the debauchery, they were kind of permitted to keep happening. You know, there wasn't a hard stop put to them. There was backlash. I will say they didn't get by completely unscathed. You know, it was looked down upon. But there was this idea that all of this was political necessary. At the time, well, first of all, the Spanish, you know, Rodrigo de Borgia, he is Spanish, and he is really looked down upon in Rome. So for his own power to stay intact, he needs to surround himself with his family to kind of combat the Italian families, the other factions in Rome who are boasting their own cardinals, their own archbishops, and seeking power for themselves. So this is like on the personal side, why it is understood that like this is just something the Pope has to do. You have to get people on side that you can trust, you know, give power to your family members, keep them in your inner circle, and you are more powerful. I also attempted to do a breakdown of like all of the political concerns of this time, but it just gets so hairy. Basically, Pope Alexander VI, Borgia, is trying to regain control of something called the Papal States, which the Vatican has lost control of up until this point. They're fighting over them with France and I think Spain and probably other people. I don't know. I'm really bad at the geography stuff and the war stuff, but there is this effort to reclaim that land as part of the Pope and the Catholic Church's rightful inheritance. So that's kind of, he's good at that stuff. So that's why his worldly pursuits are tolerated. I will say for many, it was a bridge too far. There was still an expectation of priestly restraint, which, you know, corruption and pursuits of the flesh don't really reinforce. But then also Borgia is taking his role spiritually kind of seriously. So it's a weird, I don't even think the modern mind cannot comprehend what the popes were on in the Renaissance. Contemporary descriptions of Alexander VI tell us that he was, quote, so familiar with the Holy Writ, so the Bible, the scriptures, that his speeches were fairly sparkling with well-chosen texts of the sacred books. So he wasn't entirely incompetent. He was also insanely corrupt and debauched. All of this can be true at the same time, I guess.
We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in.
Zooming in a little bit farther on his family, and particularly 4 of his children who came from the same mother. This was Alexander VI's long-term mistress, Venozia or Gianova del Catani. So we don't really know how many children Alexander VI had definitively. We have to stop counting at like 8. And those are only the ones we can verify. So his 4 children from Venozia was Giovanni, who was later made Duke of Gandia, Cesare, who is the one appointed to an archbishopship at age 17, Lucrezia, his daughter, and a last son named Gioffredo or Giuffre. These are the most commonly known because they all come from the same mother. They are also the children who he formally acknowledged. He had them live openly as his children. He openly elevated them. He lavished vast sums of money on them. He gave them every honor that he could, and in Lucrezia's case, he advanced her through politically strategic marriages. But this isn't to say that Alexander VI was faithful to his long-term mistress. No. He also had an affair with one Giulia Farnese, known as Giulia Bella, who, just like a Renaissance beauty in the show The Borgias. I think she's played by the same woman who in Outlander plays Galus Duncan. So that kind of enigmatic, very unattainable beauty, I think is what actually characterized this other mistress. With her, he had one of his other daughters named Laura. Through his many children and their eventual political alliances, Borgia is he's a pope, but he's also an ancestor of most of the royal houses of Europe, particularly in the South and West. In particular, his one daughter, Luisa, marries King John IV of Portugal, so that kind of starts a political royal dynasty. But all of Borgia's children became pawns in his game of political maneuvering. Basically, he is consolidating and securing power for not only the Vatican, but his own family. And he's not always winning at this game. As much as there were strategic wins like marriages, there were also assassinations. His son, Giovanni, the Duke of Gandia, was murdered under suspicious circumstances. No one ever found out definitively who was responsible, but there were suspicions about the Orsini family and others in the Pope's inner circle. When we talk about children being used as political pawns, we are most often talking about daughters. So let's look more closely at Lucrezia Borgia. She is the daughter of a pope, not something you can claim very often. So she is automatically a lightning rod for fascination. It helps that she physically is embodying Renaissance beauty ideals, heavily influenced by classical antiquity. So we know not a lot definitively about Lucrezia. We don't have any definitive portraits of her, but we do know through the histories that she had long blonde hair. Some people said it fell past her knees, which was a highly prized trait reminiscent of Roman goddesses like Venus and Minerva. Golden hair during the Renaissance was so desirable that women would use bleaching agents to lighten their hair. So, yeah. Lucrezia was also blessed with fair skin and a radiant complexion. These were taken as markers of nobility. They symbolized refinement and, told the world you didn't have to work under the sun for your living. You could just stay inside all day. She had hazel eyes, which were said to change color. My fiance has those eyes as well, and grinds my gears because I have to tell him, like, no, it just depends on like where you are and what color you're wearing. He's like, no, they change color. I'm like, okay. But this, in Lucrezia's day, did add to her mystique. Renaissance poets often praised eyes that had these shifting tones as alluring and otherworldly. Observers of Lucrezia also described her as effortless and graceful in her movements. They said that she appeared as though she was walking on air. Renaissance noblewomen were expected to cultivate this type of poise and elegance in their movements, and Lucrezia was fulfilling every standard. She was also said to have proportions that just also played into this ideal: a slender, fair neck and a well-shaped bust. I think a forehead is part of that as well. And a slightly large but well-formed mouth with brilliantly white teeth. Okay, beyond her physical beauty, even that's like a lot for me. Like, okay. Lucrezia was also known for her intellect and her social graces, so she had it all. Unlike most women of her time, Lucrezia received a robust humanist education from intellectuals at court and close family members on the Borgia side. She was essentially raised as an accomplished princess. She was fluent in Spanish, Catalan, Italian, and French, which made her a prime candidate for marriage to any European ruler, duke, or prince. She was also extremely literate. She was versed in both Latin and Greek. She played the lute, she wrote poetry, and was trained in public speaking. Contemporary accounts also suggest that she possessed a charm and affability that made her even more captivating. So she is the total package. Which is great because her beauty is not just serving aesthetic purposes, it is political. Noblewomen in general at this time were expected to be desirable marriage prospects, and Lucrezia's looks and refinement helped to cement alliances, of course, with the Borgia family and others in the region. So, as the daughter of a pope, this just becomes doubly important. Lucrezia had several political matches made for her over her lifetime. There were even some failed attempts. Before her first marriage, there were at least 2 betrothals that were called off because the political tides shifted. We made this alliance. Oh, we're going to break it, actually, because it's no longer the most politically expedient. Sorry. In 1493, Lucrezia's first marriage takes place. She is wed to Giovanni Sforza, whose political influence never completely lived up to its potential. Sforza is a name you will see come up. There are a few dynasties in the Italian states, like the Medici, obviously, the Borgias, the Sforzas, the Orsini. There are quite a few of them, and he's from one of those big families. But in 1497, after a couple years, Lucrezia's father had her marriage to Sforza annulled. Rumors at the time suggested that the Pope was mulling over the possibility of having Giovanni murdered. I'm sorry, not murdered, executed. That's different, and it's better. It's judicial murder is what it's called, getting somebody executed for political purposes. But he didn't do that. He annulled the marriage instead. Woke king. The reasoning was given as Lucrezia's marriage never being consummated. Sforza, who was, accused of being impotent, because who wouldn't want to sleep with your beautiful wife, who is a Borgia? Come on. Sforza responds by saying, actually, the Pope and her brother Cesare are having incestuous relationships with Lucrezia, and that's why I don't want to touch her. That is a rumor that has stuck around even to this day. This is one of the reasons I did not like the Borgias TV show, because very quickly we get to the incesty relationship part, and I don't like it. There is absolutely no evidence that this was true. It is very likely that it was just a smear campaign, but it has stuck. I think if you hear the name Lucrezia Borgia, if you know anything about her, it might be that there was some incest in her family. So yeah, not great, Giovanni. Eventually, his own family pressured him to accept the annulment. Borgia sweetened the deal by saying he would throw Lucrezia's entire dowry into Giovanni Sforza's basically divorce settlement. So the Sforza family is like, you got to take that deal. They threaten to withdraw their protection of Giovanni if he would continue to refuse the annulment. And he finally signed confessions of his own impotence and the legal documents dissolving the marriage. But yeah, this episode was so messy. It ends up being just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to criminal accusations that eventually swirl around the entire Borgia family. There are also whispers of like poisoning, of course, the judicial murder, getting people executed for your political goals, as well as extortion and bribery. Again, none of those really have been proven. Some of them kind of likely that, yeah, this probably was a thought that crossed Pope Alexander VI's mind, but we don't have any hard evidence, is all I will say. And Lucrezia's reputation is really the one that takes a beating from some of these accusations. During the long process of her annulment, rumors began circulating that Lucrezia had an affair, possibly with her father's chamberlain, Pedro Caladron, or Perotto, as he was called. Some even claimed that she had fallen pregnant as a result of this affair, which is ironic when her marriage was being actively annulled for non-consummation, but you can see how that would be a huge, huge scandal. In June 1497, this is something we see Lucrezia do a few times during her life. She goes into a convent while things are kind of tough out there in the real world. She seeks refuge in the convent of St. Sixtus in Vecchio, where she stayed until the annulment was finalized. That happened in December, so she was there for like 6 months. But this period of isolation also fueled the pregnancy rumors, tale as old as time. A woman gets whisked away to a convent to have an illegitimate baby. In early 1498, matters were not helped when the bodies of Pedro, the chamberlain, and a maid were found floating in the Tiber River. They had been drowned. That same year, an ambassador claimed that Lucrezia had given birth to a baby, not her husband's, because he is legally verified as being impotent. This, however, was denied by other sources. Now, it is true that a child, an infant named Giovanni, who was later called the Infans Romanus, did turn up in the Borgia household. There's this baby. Whose baby is this? We don't know. There are rumors that it's Lucrezia's, but also rumors that it is Cesare, her brother's, or Pope Alexander VI. In 1501, 2 conflicting papal bulls, so like decrees, are issued concerning the infant. One recognizes him as Cesare's son from an affair before his own marriage, and the other, which was kept secret for a long time, acknowledged the baby as being one of Pope Alexander's sons. Lucrezia's name is not mentioned in either document, so rumors that she was the child's mother, I think, are the weakest of all of this episode, but they are so prevalent because if you can damage this woman's reputation and take her out of the political equation, that really serves the enemies of the Borgias very well. The baby, Giovanni, he grows up to become the Duke of Camerino, which is a title tied to Cesare's acquisitions. I don't know what he's doing, but he is gaining lands. One of the lands is given to Giovanni, the baby. But after Pope Alexander VI's death, he does live with Lucrezia. He is treated as her half-brother, so we don't know. Jury's out. I am most inclined to believe that this is one of Alexander's illegitimate children because there were just so many of them, but you'll have to let me know what you think about this baby. After this incident kind of dies down, Lucrezia reemerges from the convent. She is married off a second time. This is to Alfonso of Aragon. He is the Duke of a place I really can't pronounce and Prince of Salerno. He is also an illegitimate son of the King of Naples. So Naples was a place that Borgia, as Pope, was actively seeking to kind of secure in his mission to make himself popular. So Lucrezia is married to this illegitimate son of the King of Naples in 1498. She becomes a duchess consort and a princess consort in one fell swoop. And it's actually Lucrezia, not her husband, who was appointed governor of a town called Spoleto, an ancient city in the region, in 1499. I don't know all the political ins and outs. I just know that in that same year, Alfonso is kind of on the run. He outs himself from the court. He returns at Lucrezia's request, and he is then murdered in 1500. Historical tradition says that it was Lucrezia's brother Cesare who had Alfonso of Aragon murdered, quote, after his political value waned. I will say it's a little funny to see men being subjected to this whole divorced, beheaded, died narrative. Normally it's like, oh, Henry VIII's 6 wives. He got rid of them as soon as he was sick of them. That's what's happening with Lucrezia's husbands, okay? She and Alfonso did have one son, Rodrigo of Aragon, who was born shortly after their marriage in 1499. He died in August 1512 at the age of 12. So that's sad. But as for Lucrezia, in 1500, 1501, she's kind of just getting started. I'm going to take a quick break, and then when I come back, we will look more closely at this painting, which depicts a very scandalous episode from this period of her life. And we are back, and we are going to look more closely at the painting by Frederick Cadogan Cowper, Lucrezia Borgia Reigns in the Vatican in the Absence of Pope Alexander VI. Now remember, this painting is being done like 400 years after this happened, so keep that in the back of your head. I will tell you, it does depict a historical event in a very sensationalized way. So this episode comes to us from the diary of John Bouchard, Bishop of Orta, who was the papal master of ceremonies in 1501. And he apparently wrote, quote, before His Holiness our Master left the city, he turned over the palace and all business affairs to his daughter Lucrezia, giving her full power to open all letters which arrive. Now, as to why the Pope was leaving the city, I did not find a historically verifiable reason, because I saw a commenter on Reddit give one reason that I just want to choose to believe is the truth. This person wrote, quote, the Pope and her brother basically took a couple weeks off to bang hookers at a hunting lodge. I have to choose to believe that that is the truth. So they leave Lucrezia in charge at the Vatican. Crazy. And let's take a step back here to look at women's roles in the church, which have, like the celibacy requirement, evolved over time. But I need this groundwork to portray to you the gravity of Lucrezia reigning at the Vatican. Today, that would be unthinkable because women's roles in the church remain a source of contention. But how did that play in the Renaissance is the question we need to answer here. So taking it back again to the early days of the church in antiquity, women had more influence than you might expect. In the early Christian church, women played significant roles as deaconesses, so the female version of a deacon who was kind of like a support priest, widows, which was a formal church role, and even elders in the church. Many women were active in ministry and getting the church off the ground. As the church formalized its hierarchy, moving through the centuries, women's roles became more and more restricted. So for a period of time, they could still serve as deaconesses, but they were excluded from the priesthood and any other leadership roles. By the Middle Ages, women are excluded from formal leadership and really, really discouraged from preaching, but they could still gain power through monastic communities. So think of people like Hildegard von Bingen, who in a previous episode of this podcast we did get into a little bit more. These women were abbesses who ruled over convents. They were powerful in their regions. Sometimes they had authority on the same level as bishops. And we can't discount the power that comes from having an exclusively female space run by a female. That is something I think that has been phased out of society for a reason. You did have women like Hildegard and Saint Catherine of Siena who were directly corresponding with church leaders, all the way up to popes. They were advising on major church matters, and they were kind of relating their own spiritual beliefs through, they said they had visions from heaven, and this was kind of their way, I think, to explain their own point of view and couch it in acceptable language to get it into church doctrine. However, women were barred from holding outright power within the church. They could not join the priesthood, and their teaching authority was always questioned. By the Renaissance, especially in the papal court, women like Lucrezia could access new heights in education, but that did not translate into greater church authority. The Protestant Reformation, from like around this time, a little later, is attacking female religious life. You have convents and monasteries shutting down. Many nuns are being stripped of their autonomy. And then you, of course, have a counter Reformation in the Catholic Church later in the 16th century, which tightened control over women's roles even further. This is the period where female mysticism starts to be discouraged, and their abilities to teach even other women are really, really stifled. That's not to say you don't ever see female thought leaders pop up again. You have people like Saint Teresa of Avila, who would become an influential reformer of the Carmelite order. But where they could get it, women still wielded spiritual authority, but it was getting harder and harder to grab onto. But as for acting as a regent, essentially, in church and Vatican affairs, that was pretty unheard of. So Lucrezia was placed on the papal throne for a very short period of time. Her father leaves town for whatever reason, and he gives her the authority to conduct basically administrative affairs. She is barred from doing anything religious, making any rulings on spiritual practice. But instead, she is a stand-in for his kind of business dealings and apparently had broad authority to make whatever diplomatic decisions were needed. And in this role, Lucrezia proved to be very capable. Why would her father choose her? Well, if we assume that Cesare, her brother, was off banging hookers in hunting lodge with him, I'm still assuming that's the reason. Lucrezia is kind of the next closest relative who I believe Pope Alexander would have believed capable enough to take on this kind of work. And remember, the nepotism angle is so important. He needs people around him he can trust. Lucrezia, I think, had been training for this. She had been said to sit in on meetings with the Pope, help him with his correspondence, and even respond to letters for him. So she's already kind of doing this work behind the scenes. And as he's leaving town, he needs a regent. Family loyalty apparently trumps misogyny for this brief period of time. A win for feminism. We will take it. We need to grab every ounce of it we can.
We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in.
So Lucrezia, simply the best person for the job. Take that, DEI initiatives. No, I'm kidding. So she's taking on this role that isn't unheard of in Renaissance society. You have women like Isabella d'Este and Catherine de' Medici who wielded significant political influence. But those women had formal legitimacy because of their husbands. One was a noblewoman and the other was a queen in France. But Lucrezia was placed in this position of power by her father as a temporary measure, yes, but we have to assume because of her ability. So yeah, like I said, a small win. And this is in a setting where women had no precedent for leadership for like the last 1,000 years. Her placement in this role and her success as an administrator strengthens the argument that women could and did govern effectively when given the chance, even in spaces when they weren't meant to hold power. So looking at the painting by Frank Cowper, he has invented the specific moment that we are seeing, but the basis for the scene is this short period of time where Lucrezia is reigning in the Vatican. So the scene that he has invented is taking place at the center of the canvas. Lucrezia is sitting in a white dress on the papal throne, and two noblemen, one on either side of her, are parting the front of her dress so that a Franciscan friar can kiss her shoe. So this moment, we don't know that it ever happened. Cowper has invented it, and I think that was to heighten the tension of the historical account, telling us that she did stand in for her father, the Pope. The subject matter that he's chosen, a monk kissing a woman's foot, it's a little bit suggestive, it's a little bit sensual, and ultimately that underlines the controversial and scandalous nature of this scene as it would have appeared to the men in the rest of the picture. Lucrezia, from what I can tell, is the only woman here. So, what must all of these cardinals have been thinking? Are they viewing Lucrezia as, I think we are supposed to interpret her from this painting, as a femme fatale? Instead of being shown as a competent leader here, she is being reduced to a few stereotypes. We will get into that a little bit more as we talk about the choices that Cowper has made in depicting her. But I think right off the bat, you can see that Lucrezia, in her white dress at the middle of this sea of red, is exhibiting calm authority. And her male dominated surroundings, really contrast with her state of mind, with her physical presence. She can so easily be read one of two ways. She can be read as haughty and maybe conceited. She's looking very stoic, but like, yes, I belong on this throne. But I think there would have been another way to depict her if the artist so chose. We've gone with this very tense theatrical scene, the contrast between the white and the red, but we could have done this differently. We could have shown her as a capable ruler, somebody there because of her merit, and we chose not to. So let's unpack that. What Cowper has done is say, yes, this episode was scandalous, and so the depiction has to be equally provocative. The drama in Lucrezia's person and the sensual nature of her gown being parted kind of serves to translate, I think, the gravity of the moment we are seeing to a more modern audience and really instill in us, like, this is crazy what is happening here. To link this episode back to history, Cowper began the painting actually in Rome, within the Borgia apartments of the Vatican. According to catalog notes on the painting from the Tate, quote, these had been occupied by Cardinal Mary de Laval, the papal secretary of state, and were not open to the public, but had been vacated just before the artist first came to Rome in 1908, so he was able to paint there. The Tate also tells us that the room in the Vatican in which Lucrezia appeared still exists. It was decorated by the Italian Renaissance artist Pinturicchio, and this decoration is also painstakingly communicated in Cowper's portrait. Well, it's not really a portrait, painting. Notably, the two frescoes on the walls on either side of Lucrezia show the Annunciation and the Nativity. Those are on either side of the throne, so those are actually taken from life. Cowper went to these apartments to copy the paintings, and he also painted the faces of the cardinals in the scene from original portraits of them. So we have this backing of historical accuracy bolstering this imagined scene. There are specific cardinals that we can identify. One that is writing on the right of Lucrezia is Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, who afterwards became Pope Leo X. And there's one on the left holding back her robe. That is Cardinal Farnese, afterwards Paul III. The cardinal standing on Lucrezia's right is the Cardinal of Lisbon, who advised Lucrezia on her official duties during this time. One of the things I love most about this painting is the cardinals. Okay, they have their red robes and their hats, but that sea of red is extended beyond them. It overflows into the very architectural features of the room. So the whole scene is just bathed in red. It's kind of akin to the portrait of Charles III by Jonathan Yeo, which we all hated. Because red, it stands for power, passion, and it's kind of like charged. There's this charged conversation, I'm sure, happening in the room. So that really comes through in the choice to bathe the scene in this red. But at the center of it is Lucrezia with her, quote, calm demeanor and commanding posture, adding an air of control and defiance, inviting the viewer to question the role of women and power in a male-dominated hierarchy. So she's almost challenging not just the cardinals in the room, but us, like, to question her. And I imagine some of them are. If you look at the facial features of the cardinals in the room, some of them are looking a little suspicious. Some of them do look like they're impressed by her, though. So there is this ambiguous morality going on with this moment in time. But we're not just viewing this historical moment through the lens of a painting. We're also viewing it through the lens of an artistic movement. So Cowper, he's painting in 1910. He is one of the very last pre-Raphaelites. He's often called, actually, the last pre-Raphaelite. I didn't just make that up. So this is the style that he's working in. And I was reflecting on why choose Lucrezia if you want to work in this style. Why this? Why did you do this? Why, Frank? So, a bit about the Pre-Raphaelites, who I don't remember if we've really touched on too much yet. This is an artistic movement that was founded in 1848 by British artists, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt. The movement really rejected the very academic style of painting that was popularized. We've talked about it in France, in Britain, the Royal Academy. These salon shows had a very strong type of painting that they were looking for. This accepted type of painting followed the artistic ideals of Raphael and the High Renaissance. But instead, the Pre-Raphaelites looked earlier to the early Renaissance. Pre-Raphael. They looked to people like Fra Angelico and Botticelli, who we have talked about, who are working in kind of this proto-Renaissance style, and that's where they took their inspiration instead. So what you see are very vivid colors, intricate detail, and dramatic theatrical compositions in Pre-Raphaelite paintings. These scenes not only romanticize, but often reimagine medieval and Renaissance subjects. You can often pick out Pre-Raphaelite paintings by their idealized depictions of women. They usually have this very long, flowing head of hair and very striking beauty. So how does Lucrezia fit into this? Why is she being chosen to be at the center of a painting by a Pre-Raphaelite? And how does this compare to realistic depictions of Renaissance women? Now, remember, I said Cowper is often called the last Pre-Raphaelite. He dies in, I think, the 1950s. He is one of the last people carrying these themes well into the 20th century. Think about what's going on here. We are coming out of the Victorian era, right? It's 1910, give or take. Pre-Raphaelite painters are kind of fading away, but artists like Cowper are clinging on for dear life to this tradition. It really is about tradition. He is taking a lot of even obscure historical details. The one diary entry that mentions Lucrezia standing in for the Pope, that's pretty obscure. But the tradition of artistic license with the Pre-Raphaelites, I think, is being wielded very strategically here. Lucrezia Borgia is the perfect subject for the Pre-Raphaelite style. She is known kind of as a historical enigma. Was she this ruthless femme fatale, or was she unfairly maligned? Her life was full of intrigue, even if it was just kind of happening around her. There were these power struggles, betrayal, loyalty, etc. All of this aligned with the dramatic narratives that the Pre-Raphaelites loved. And of course, her legendary beauty made her an ideal subject for the movement's fascination with ethereal, idealized women. She has the long, flowing golden hair. It's perfectly suited for a Pre-Raphaelite painting. But Cowper is choosing this subject in 1910. It's the Edwardian era. This is a time of contradiction. We are moving away from Victorian traditions to an era where women are starting to demand independence. You have the suffragette movements, you have concerns about higher education and family planning. Traditional views of femininity are remaining steadfast and biting back in a lot of ways. It helps to remember, too, that the world is modernizing very quickly. You have industrialization, the first automobiles, and then, again, voting rights for women. Many artists are a little bit anxious about this. They're longing for the romanticism of the past and rejecting modernity in their works. To do this, what better place to look back to and kind of rewrite than the Renaissance and the medieval age? There's also a cultural obsession at this time, which Cowper plays into, with the dangerous woman. We talked a little bit about this with Madame X, the desire to paint women with autonomy as femme fatales, who were actually using their beauty and charm to manipulate men. We had this anxiety pop up as well in our Halloween special last year, the Witch-tacular episode. Often these women are wielding power in male spaces, but for their troubles, they are sexualized and villainized. Popular literature and theater of the time featured historical femme fatales like Cleopatra, Salome, and Lucrezia Borgia. So I think it is a conscious choice on the artist's part. Instead of presenting Lucrezia as a capable administrator, which she was, Cowper is leaning into her scandalous reputation, her role as a provocative figure at the center of the Vatican, and her controversy. His painting doesn't depict Lucrezia actually making political decisions or ruling. Instead, she's just kind of sitting back in her chair and letting this monk kiss her feet. The painting emphasizes her beauty and the sensuality of the moment, reinforcing the idea that women's influence came through their charms rather than their direct authority. Let's go back to reality for a minute and examine, well, maybe he's just like, I don't know, parroting how people felt about Lucrezia. Let's look at what actually happened. So, Alexander VI returns to Rome after, I assume, getting his fill of hookers in the hunting lodge. And Lucrezia Borgia's formal authority ends. Her role during his absence did not significantly alter her standing in his court. I assume she probably went back to helping him from time to time, but she has a third marriage on the horizon. In 1502, she is married off for the final time to Alfonso d'Este. After her marriage, she would have moved with Alfonso to Ferrara, an Italian city that was on the up and up as an international cultural center. Ferrara was renowned for its architecture, its music, its literature, and the visual arts. And there, the couple would inherit the titles of Duke and Duchess of Ferrara in 1505. Their union was, by all accounts, very successful. They had 8 children together, and this played into Lucrezia's final act as being considered a, quote, respectable and accomplished Renaissance duchess. Effectively, she was able to rise above her previous reputation. All of the political intrigues, the whispers about her, having children outside of wedlock, etc., etc. But Lucrezia was not above a bit of personal intrigue during this marriage. She and Alfonso both had affairs. Her most notable one was with her brother-in-law, Francesco il Gonzaga, who was the Marquess of Mantua. Francesco was married to Alfonso's sister, Isabella d'Este, who is known as one of the leading ladies of the Renaissance. She is very cultured and very intellectual. It's not certain that any of these affairs were consummated, so keep that in mind. Lucrezia also had a love affair with the poet Pietro Bembo during her third marriage. Their love letters to each other have been deemed, quote, the prettiest love letters in the world. That quote, unfortunately, comes to us from Romantic poet Lord Byron. He saw them in the Ambrosian Library of Milan in 1816. On the same occasion, which I hate, Byron claimed to have stolen a lock of Lucrezia's hair. He called it the prettiest and fairest imaginable that was also on display in the library. So that's gross. It's giving Hugh Hefner being obsessed with Marilyn Monroe. There is a picture of this lock of hair. I will put it on the Instagram for you. It is very pretty, although I will say that hair naturally lightens over time, like after a person dies. If you, for whatever reason, sometimes dig them up and look at their hair. Sorry, this is a weird sentence. Hair does lose pigment over time, is what I'm trying to say. But in life, Lucrezia's new role as Duchess of Ferrara was proving her to be a highly competent administrator once again. She also got away from the political scheming of her family, perhaps drawing on all of that experience of her early life and maybe the confidence that she got from being named her father's regent in his absence. Lucrezia embraced her role as Duchess. She became a notable patron of the arts and fostered a vibrant cultural environment at her court. Her tenure in Ferrara was characterized by, quote, a shift towards a more stable and respected position, contrasting with the tumultuous events of her earlier life. So the image we are seeing of her in Cowper's painting in 1910 is completely imagined. He doesn't know how she actually handled her duties, and it doesn't tell us much about how Lucrezia was viewed by her contemporaries. To that end, no confirmed portrait of Lucrezia actually exists. We cannot actually definitively say we know what she looked like. But that doesn't stop scholars and art historians from trying to positively identify one. So that's the influence of this woman. We are still clamoring to know what she looked like. Was she a femme fatale or this sort of angelic beauty? We don't know.
We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in.
There are two bronze medals that do definitively depict Lucrezia. They are attributed to the artist Gian Cristoforo Romano. Their inscriptions do translate to Lucrezia Borgia d'Este, Duchess, and were made circa 1502 to 1505. These medals were often made to commemorate weddings, anniversaries, deaths, or celebrations. So maybe, I don't know, becoming a duchess. They show off essentially her wealth, her beauty, and her status. There are some paintings that have been argued as well to depict her. The most famous is Portrait of a Woman by Bartolomeo Veneto. This is traditionally presumed to be Lucrezia. I believe it's even used on the cover of her biography. And it's really the woman in the painting's, quote, distinct and stylized golden hair that makes people assume that this is an image of Lucrezia. And I have to hand it to them. The physical appearance of the woman in this painting does fit with the few descriptions that we have of her. The painting, though, is speculated to have been made around 1520, so it would have been created after Lucrezia's death, which means probably not the most realistic. And the way that this woman is depicted kind of reinforces that idea. She is wearing this very loosely draped garment. She has an exposed breast, and she's wearing a laurel wreath crown. So it's possible that this might be a depiction of Flora, the Roman goddess of springtime, who we also talked about in the Botticelli episode. That's one of my favorites to this day. It's possible that this is still Lucrezia, just like being depicted in that role as Flora. That is very common. So she would have been taking on the ideal form of beauty and sensuality for all eternity, if that's the case. But we don't know. There is another painting by Veneto that is Portrait of a Young Lady, not Portrait of a Woman. That one's also argued to be Lucrezia. The most interesting one to me, actually, is by an artist called Dosso Dossi, 2 words, which is purported to depict her, and it is owned by the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia. They purchased the painting in London in 1965 before it was ever linked to Lucrezia. You have to believe, like, it wouldn't have gone to Australia, no offense, Australia, if there was a rumor that this was actually Lucrezia. But it was actually only in 2008 that major technical examinations were undertaken of the painting, which I do have on the Instagram for you. It is the one that is an oval shape, which is very rare in the Renaissance. It was actually assumed that oval-shaped paintings did not exist in Italy in the earliest part of the 16th century. The only exceptions were identified during this examination, and they were by the same artist. So fun, I guess, fun little art historical fact for you. But with this specific painting, it was assumed that the original had been a rectangle and then it was cut down to be an oval. It was also assumed that the flowers in the background were a later addition and were added at the same time. This, when further research was undertaken, this was disproven. The artist was firmly attributed to be Dosso Dossi, and he was working, interestingly, in Ferrara within the court of the Este family. So this is where Lucrezia lived, and he was there between 1515 and 1520. So all signs are pointing to the fact that this artist, at the very least, would have known Lucrezia, if not had been commissioned to paint her. So when it comes to the sitter in this portrait, that is the thing most re-examined in 2008. It had previously been assumed that the sitter in the portrait was a young man, not necessarily because of his physical features, but because of what he or she is holding in their hands. In their hands is what is thought to be a dagger, or the hilt of a dagger. This was thought to be, a symbol of masculinity, but on re-examination, if we think, okay, this might be a woman and it might be Lucrezia, then the dagger could become a symbolic reference to another Lucrezia. This one, a 6th century BC heroine of ancient Rome, who took her own life with a dagger following her rape in order to preserve her family honor. Kind of messed up, but this would have been an interesting thing to include in a portrait of Lucrezia. Not just a link to her name, but perhaps an acknowledgement of her desire to repair her own reputation to preserve her family honor. Of course, her reputation was tarnished, I think, because of who her family was, but I digress. In good art historical research, though, it's not enough to say, okay, I'm hoping it's this person, and here's the reasons that I'm going to now attribute to that person. You kind of have to go about it like much more objectively. So the study in 2008, instead of focusing on Lucrezia herself, first tried to prove that the sitter was a woman. And that was done by re-examining the symbols, aside from the dagger, like the myrtle bush and the flowers behind the sitter. These are, in the Renaissance, symbolic references to the goddess Venus, a timeless symbol of feminine beauty. Then there is the Latin inscription on like the little ledge in front of the sitter. This reads, "Brighter than beauty is the virtue reigning in this beautiful body." So this is an adaptation of a verse from Virgil's Aeneid. I never know if I'm saying that one right. This verse was also used almost exclusively to describe female beauty. So that is kind of proving in 2008 to these scholars at the National Gallery of Victoria, okay, this is a woman. Now we can connect it and try and figure out who she was. You do have all of these references to Venus, the inscription, and the flowers. Incidentally, the Borgia family did use Venus as a family emblem, so that's a possible connection there. And then, of course, everything I mentioned earlier with the dagger linking to the Roman Lucretia and then Lucrezia. You'll have to let me know what you think of this theory. It was announced as if it was definitively fact in 2008. Obviously, it can't really ever be unless we have a positive identification in like a chronicle or a first-hand account from the time. But it's cool. I personally believe this might be her. Yeah, I'd be willing to put a 5 on that. Yeah. The context of this painting too, coming from the early 1500s, when portraits of women were pretty rare. Only a woman of the highest nobility would have been placed on the level of, getting her portrait done and then linking her to a goddess. That's crazy. As well as a possible heroine of ancient Rome, if we go with the Lucretia angle. And if you're looking at the time and the place in which this portrait was most likely created, Lucrezia Borgia is, quote, the only candidate who matches these specific references. So I think that's a pretty strong case. This press release was, I think, put out by paintings conservator Carl Willis, who did the research and examination. He also argues that the profile of the sitter in the painting matches up with the 2 medals that we do know depict Lucrezia. So that's a little bit more subjective, but there you go. And the final supposed portrait of Lucrezia, which I do think is her, is in the Vatican itself. It's part of a fresco by the artist Pinturicchio, showing Pope Alexander VI and his family. These he commissioned, so it's Lucrezia's father commissioning these paintings. They're supposed to cover the 6 suites inside the Borgia apartments, and they are now part of the Vatican Library. The frescoes would have been completed between 1492 and 1494, so Lucrezia would have been around 12 to 14 years old. The specific part of the frescoes that have been identified as probably being Lucrezia depict St. Catherine of Alexandria. This is something that happened in the Renaissance. Wealthy patrons, people commissioning artworks, would insert themselves into religious scenes, either praying to saints or like maybe at the nativity praying to the baby Jesus. Sometimes they took on the guise of a saint, kind of like they did with goddesses in the Renaissance as well. So portraying Lucrezia as St. Catherine does make sense. It would have solidified her status as a well-brought-up, pious, and pure young woman. Incidentally, the frescoes do also definitively show Pope Alexander himself as himself praying, so he's there. It's also pretty much confirmed that his son Cesare and his mistress Julia Farnese also make appearances. So it kind of stands to reason that his daughter would be included as well. So I'll put that on the Instagram as well. It is beautiful. I think that's like a pretty nice representation of her, if it is indeed Lucrezia. In 1519, Lucrezia gives birth to her final child. Her reputation at this point is unfairly tarnished by the villainous acts of her brother and father. This came from the National Gallery of Victoria, so they have a vested interest in rewriting the history about her. But in 1519, she has a very difficult birth with her 10th child, who I think passes away. Lucrezia herself becomes ill and she passes away 2 days later at the age of 39. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara. So that's a lot. I know I just threw a lot at you, but I just want to illustrate this is just the life of one pope, right? There are so many more. And I just, what I want you to understand is the papacy has always been messy as hell. So this is the point where I'm going to discuss the film Conclave, because this is what made me want to move this painting up the list and do it this month for you. So some, not really spoilers for the movie, but the themes I'm going to talk about, I think, make the most sense if you have finished the movie, I will say. So my connection to this painting, I gave you my context of myself, my own relationship to the church as a woman. There was just something so poignant in seeing this painting, and I know it's supposed to be scandalous, and I know it's supposed to be provocative, but seeing a woman sitting on the papal throne, perhaps for the only time in history, I don't know. There's something really juicy there, and it causes a reexamination of the history of women in the church. And for that reason, I love this painting. I love it so much. I think it also is very poignant that on either side of Lucrezia in the painting, and this honestly might be a message that was even lost on Cowper as he's painting it, because I don't trust a man, especially an Edwardian man, to get it. There are paintings on the either side of Lucrezia depicting the Virgin Mary. You have the Annunciation, where she is told she's going to have baby Jesus, and then there's the Nativity, where she gives birth to baby Jesus. And the Virgin Mary, again, if you're not Catholic, you might not really get it. Well, no, you probably will, because there is this misconception that Catholics worship Mary, which is not true. We hold her very highly, and there's this understanding that as the mother of Jesus, she's also the mother of God, because the Trinity. And she has an influence in his life and his dealings even now. So the idea of praying to saints, not to worship them, but to ask for their intercession for us, is extending to Mary as well. So Catholics really, really have a special place for her. And seeing her on either side of Lucrezia, who is like this woman who a lot of people absolutely just believe the worst about, is interesting. Because one thing that is true of the Catholic Church is that it does have this habit, I would say a bad habit, of subjugating women to the roles of, handmaids, helpmates, supporting cast. And that's explored in the movie Conclave. Isabella Rossellini, oh my God. She plays this nun, I forget her name in the movie, but she has this line at one point, I think it's in the trailer, so it's not really a spoiler, where she's like, listen, she's like observing all this messy as hell stuff that's going down with the conclave, with the election of a new pope, and she says, listen, you might think that women need to be seen and not heard, but God has given us eyes and ears. And that's what started my wheels spinning in my head. Like, yeah, this is all, and this comes back to why personally I have issues with the church. Like, this is all the decision of men. This is all just an institutional gateway that is closed in our faces as women. That does get explored a little bit more in the film. You don't necessarily expect it or see it coming, but there is this sense that all of this political intrigue and maneuvering, first of all, for what? Just power? Okay. But at the same time, if you're forgetting about women or setting the system up to deplatform them, that can come back to bite you in surprising ways, despite your best efforts. And that's all I will say about that. I didn't necessarily expect Conclave to be a film that spoke to my specific feelings about being female and being Catholic, but it did. And I feel like that's something that's missing in the commentary about it from a critic's perspective. Because I don't know if you can tap into that unless you are a Catholic woman. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. If you have watched the movie, let me know how you feel about this. And obviously there is a little bit more to the story here that I can't reveal, but it's just a lot to chew on. And I'm really glad that this painting existed and allowed me to do that today. Because I said, this is an ongoing issue starting in the Enlightenment, the 1700s, up through the 19th century. You see women being pushed further and further to the margins as the Catholic Church fully cements itself as a male-dominated institution. Women, as they so often were barred from higher education, were barred from official theological study or from church leadership. Many monasteries and convents were dissolved, these places where women had autonomy and power, as the world, and especially Europe, became more secularized after the French Revolution, for example. It was more often than not a subordinate role rather than an authoritative one that would be open to a woman. Women did continue to serve as nuns, as teachers. How many of us have an experience with a Catholic school teacher who also happens to be a nun, as well as missionaries? But most often, those women are reporting to a priest or to a bishop. They don't have the final say. As we get into the 20th century, we still see no formal positions of power available to women, and in fact, there is some weakening, even if it's the middle of the 20th century, some weakening of women's roles in the church. Vatican II, which is a period of church reform in the 60s, was seeking to modernize, but really set women back. Before this point, nuns had a distinct and somewhat elevated status in the church. They were considered part of the hierarchical church, so they weren't on the level of priests, but they still commanded respect. They were still part of the clerical system. After Vatican II, nuns get reclassified as lay people. So they're essentially stripped of any remaining official standing. A lot of people don't know this because nuns are like really scary people. But they don't have this official standing within the church system. Reforms at this time also removed the habit for a lot of religious female orders, which was, again, meant to modernize, but really just led to an identity crisis for many women who were in the religious life. And even today, we're in the 21st century, sadly, we're still fighting for women's rights. And in fact, I think we'll be doing a lot more of that in the next few years as the system is challenged and bites back. But there are these ongoing debates corresponding to that over women's roles in the church. Women, of course, in the Catholic Church are still barred from the priesthood despite growing pressure from progressive factions and, outside religions. Some Protestant religions have women who are the clergy, and that's amazing. In 2021, seemingly in a concession to this, Pope Francis did officially allow women to serve as lectors and acolytes, so reading scripture and assisting during Mass. I have to laugh because this is something that had been happening. Women are allowed to read the Bible and they are allowed to read it in front of a congregation. The priest is the one who has to still give the scripture, or not the scripture, the sermon. But it was only formalized in 2021. That's crazy. And it still stops far short from allowing any actual leadership for women. And at this point, you wonder why. Like, is it so important to our religion that, no offense, people with penises have to be the ones in charge? Like, what? Show me where in scripture. Not St. Paul. Don't you dare show me St. Paul, because he's just a guy, So this ongoing movement does advocate still for women to have a greater role in the church. Specifically right now, there's a question about allowing women to become deacons, which, as I've said, are sort of like support staff to priests. My understanding is like they can do some of the stuff priests do, and if they are married, they can become deacons, but if their wife passes away, they cannot remarry, is kind of where that line gets drawn. But the church is resisting, even as there is an active crisis in the number of young men entering the priesthood. Quite often you go to church and you are told to pray for men to like discern the priesthood and enter the seminary and become celibate. That number is dwindling. It's not sexy anymore to go become a priest. I don't understand. Like, it just hurts the church in the end to continue barring women from these roles. But alas, what do I know? I'm just a woman. There are some great female theologians and activists on the ground continuing to push for change, arguing that early Christianity did support greater female participation, which is a fact. So it's all cultural at the end of the day, which people do forget. Because a lot of the time, like I said, when you're talking about popes, it's through a lens of spirituality and like, what did they do for the church? But it's not so much, okay, what was going on around them? What societal influences impact their choices or impact the direction that the church is going in? So let me know what you think, particularly A, if you're Catholic, B, if you're a Reformed Catholic, or C, if you've seen the movie Conclave, which again, highly recommend. I really enjoyed it. And it kind of asks you to chew on a lot of these issues. And like, you look at these you look at these cardinals running around the Vatican, and you're like, what is all this for? Where are the women? Where are the women? So that's going to be it for me today. Let me know your thoughts over on the Instagram at Art of History Podcast. You can also send me an email at artofhistorypod@gmail.com. Please, please, please do leave us a nice rating, 5 stars preferably. You can do that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you are so inclined, I would love to read your reviews on Apple Podcasts. I really love reading reviews and posting them. It gives me a lot of joy. I love feedback. Have I mentioned this before? I really love getting feedback. So your reviews are a nice form of feedback. That's going to be it for me today. Take care of one another. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.